The 2nd century. Summary. Well, we've made it to the end of the 2nd century. Thanks for joining me on this trip back through the past 10 decades. This will be the first of 3 episodes recapping and covering wider trends that perhaps we didn't have a chance to dwell on during the decade-by-decade narrative. This installment is a summary of the past 10 decades as well as a few superlatives for the emperors. Who was best, who was worst, and who was okayest. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that I've started a Substack based on this series. Rather than posting a full decade at a time, on Substack I'm publishing individual parts of decades there, with maps and pictures to help with context. Check it out if you want to relive moments from the first 2 centuries in a more bite-sized format. You can find this at 202decades.substack.com. Alright, let's jump into our summary. Just as the 1st century all comes back to Augustus, the 2nd century all comes back to Trajan. He came to power in the wake of the senatorial elections of Nerva as emperor. This followed the death of Domitian. Nerva wasn't respected by the army, and it seems the Praetorians pushed him to adopt Trajan. Before long, Nerva died, and Trajan was suddenly emperor. In a demonstration of his self-assuredness and popularity, instead of heading right for Rome, the new emperor toured the provinces on the northern frontier. He didn't need Rome to be emperor. When Trajan did go to Rome, he entered humbly and with respect to the Senate. With their blessing, Trajan soon began a war with the Dacians, a people living across the Danube River from Roman territory in modern Romania. The motivations of the war were a mix of revenge for past defeats, elimination of a threat, acquisition of gold, and glory for Trajan himself. The king of the Dacians, Commodus, put up a decent fight, but when the Roman victory was clear, he surrendered before his capital was taken. The peace terms made Dacia a client kingdom and placed a Roman garrison in their capital, but also gave them money and engineers to secure their northern border against migrating tribes. A stone bridge was built across the Danube River to ensure the legions could get to Dacia. Commodus used the money and engineers to build fortresses, not to defend the north, but to defend himself from Rome. Soon enough, he was funding nearby tribes as proxy fighters to harass the Romans. Commodus had to go. Trajan gathered another army and went back to war with Dacia. This second Dacian war, just a few years after the first, was more total. The Dacian capital was sieged and seized. Commodus was cornered and he committed suicide rather than be captured. Dacia was made a full Roman province. Rome gained its stunning gold mines. The process of Romanization began. While Trajan conquered Dacia, his generals elsewhere secured control over Nabatea in modern Jordan. This gave the Romans control over lucrative trade routes to the Indian Ocean and cut out the Nabateans as expensive middlemen. Trajan spent some time in Rome improving and beautifying the city. In 113, though, news arrived that the Parthians had deposed the king of Armenia and replaced him with a more Parthian-friendly ruler. This broke a treaty with Rome, and Trajan prepared for war. He made Antioch his base and rapidly advanced into Armenia with overwhelming force. He deposed the new king and annexed the country as a province into the empire. His attention turned south into Parthia. After a not-so-restful winter in Antioch, a terrible earthquake struck and killed tens of thousands. Trajan and his army descended into Mesopotamia, defeated the Parthian army, and captured their greatest city, Seleucia, and their capital, Ctesiphon. His army continued all the way to the Persian Gulf. These Parthian conquests were on their way to becoming 2 new provinces, Assyria in the north and Mesopotamia in the south. Unfortunately for the Romans, integration of these new provinces was interrupted by massive revolts in Cyrene, in Judea, on Cyprus, and across the newly conquered territory. These rebellions are called the Kitos War, or the Second Jewish Revolt. Trajan tried to hold on to everything and put down the revolts. But this wasn't easy. The rebellions weren't small. Legions had been pulled from their bases to take part in his campaigns. The Jewish rebels did great damage in Cyprus, in Cyrene, and in Alexandria. Just as the revolts among the Jewish diaspora began to be contained, Trajan fell ill and died. The succession fell to Hadrian, Trajan's close cousin and a favorite of his wife. The legitimacy of the succession was sketchy, but Hadrian had control of the armies, and no one could argue with that. Hadrian immediately abandoned the Parthian conquests and turned Armenia back into a client kingdom. He felt Rome had been stretched too thin. Consolidation, rather than expansion, was what was best for his empire. Trajan's generals, who were committed to expansion, were purged. As emperor, Hadrian spent his reign not in Rome, but touring the provinces, governing from wherever he happened to be that week. He surveyed each province he came to, inspected the legions, doled out favor, and ordered improvements. Hadrian's most memorable contributions was the wall, Hadrian's Wall, which spanned right across the island of Britannia. The stone wall served as a checkpoint, a barrier, and a boundary. Later on his travels, he beautified Athens and attempted to refound Jerusalem as a pagan city, now called Aelia Capitolina. His vision was to unite the empire under Greek culture, Roman law, and defended by the legions. Hadrian soon found that not all of his subjects were on board with this project of assimilation. A Jewish rebel named Simon Bar Kokhba revolted in the early 130s and successfully threw the Romans out of Judea. In this third Jewish revolt, the fledgling Judean state slowly but continually ceded territory to the crushing force of the legions. As usual, the Romans won in the end. Judea was severely depopulated. Jews were forbidden from coming within sight of what had been called Jerusalem, and as punishment, Judea was renamed Palestina after the Philistines, the old enemy of the Jews. From this name change, we get the modern name Palestine. When Hadrian passed, the succession fell to Antoninus Pius. Antoninus wasn't his first choice, but Hadrian settled on him under the condition that he adopt two young men, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius. But Antoninus, although he wasn't young, ruled longer than anyone expected. His reign was the late summer of the Pax Romana. There were 2 decades of peace, stability, prosperity, and continuity across the empire. A new wall was built north of Hadrian's Wall in Britannia. Legal reforms extended justice. The few disturbances were minor. When Pius died in 161, Marcus Aurelius became emperor, as expected. But he insisted on elevating his legal brother as well. The Senate wasn't enthused at the idea of Lucius Verus sharing rule, but they relented at the insistence of the well-respected Marcus. They all knew he would be the real brains behind the operation of ruling. Before the two emperors had a chance to settle into their role, the Parthians decided to test them. They, again, broke the treaty with Rome over Armenia. Now, the governor of Cappadocia, assured by oracles of success, attempted to right the situation. But he was ambushed and his legion scattered. At the same time, a Parthian army crossed the Euphrates River, and in the initial fighting with the Syrian legion, the Romans fled at first contact. It was a bad opening act of the war. Emperor Lucius Verus was sent by Marcus to Antioch to lead the large and better planned Roman response. Lucius himself was barely involved, but the Roman generals successfully defeated the Parthians in battle and then advanced into their territory. They sacked the metropolitan city of Seleucia and burned down the Parthian palace in Ctesiphon. They returned home with splendid loot. And with the plague. This Antonine Plague, which was probably measles or smallpox, was extraordinarily deadly, killing probably 10 to 15% of the population. Large urban areas were hit the hardest, so were the legions in their close quarters. The German and Sarmatian tribes across the Danube were not so severely affected. They had been quiet for several decades, but a few factors led them to strike into Roman territory now. Pressure from more distant tribes encroaching on their land, the reduced number of soldiers along their borders due to the Parthian War and the plague, and increasing organization amongst and between the tribes. All these factors led the king of the Marcomanni to coordinate action against the Romans across a dozen different tribes. The legions were taken off guard. The invasions began with a small trickle, but soon tens of thousands of German and Sarmatian warriors poured across the Danube, striking into several provinces at once. The largest band made its way straight for Italy. They made the mistake, though, of getting stuck besieging Aquileia, and this held them in place long enough for a large Roman army to gather and push them back. Recruitment and fielding a full army was stranged by the scourge of the plague. Even Lucius Verus died from the disease in 169. Marcus proved he was more than just a philosopher by leading the response. For the next 10 years, on and off fighting kept the Romans busy. Thanks to the tireless efforts of Marcus Aurelius, nearly all of the fighting had been pushed into enemy territory. He was relentless in his reprisals. Just as things were settling down, Avidius Cassius, the hero general of the Parthian Wars, rebelled. Fortunately for the empire, he was killed before a real civil war began. Marcus finally took a break from war with the Germans and celebrated a triumph with his son and heir, Commodus. But peace didn't hold. He had to return to the frontier and spent his final years trying to turn the territory of the Germans and Sarmatians into two new provinces. When Marcus died, Commodus became emperor and quickly abandoned his father's plans. He made a hasty peace and returned to Rome. His reign was marked by peace, but corruption. He had a series of advisors who rose and fell through corruption and mismanagement. This malpractice upset many of the legions, and desertion spread across the west of the empire. In the meantime, Commodus slipped more and more into his embarrassing obsessions with animal hunts and gladiatorial fighting. On January 1st, 193, Commodus was killed by his mistress and his praetorian prefect. They picked Pertinax to be his successor. Pertinax tried to right the wrongs of his predecessor, but he did too much too fast. The Praetorians were angered. They killed Pertinax and auctioned off the empire to the highest bidder. The winner was Julianus. Although backed by the Praetorians, he held no legitimacy with the people, the Senate, or the legions in the field. 3 governors were posed to claim the emperorship for themselves: Niger in Syria, Severus in Pannonia, and Albinus in Britain. As Severus marched on Rome, he convinced Albinus to become his ally. Severus gained control of the city, purged the old Praetorians, and left for the east to defeat Niger. The Severan army repeatedly bested Niger's. The Syrian governor was killed, and Byzantium, his base for a time, was destroyed. Severus then betrayed Albinus, marched back west, and defeated him at Lugdunum in modern France. Lugdunum, which had been the greatest city of Gaul, was destroyed. Taking no breaks, Severus went back east and campaigned against Parthia. He took Ctesiphon, their capital, and destroyed this too. As the century comes to a close, Severus was in Alexandria with his son and heir, Caracalla. Whew, that was a lot. Longer than I expected. Let's tally a few things and then talk superlatives. We've seen a lot of wars this century. the Dacian War, Trajan's Parthian War, the Kitos War, the Bar Kokhba War, Antoninus' expedition north of Hadrian's Wall, Marcus and Lucius's Parthian War, the Marcomannic Wars, and the civil wars following Commodus' death, and Severus's Parthian War. And let's quickly review our list of emperors. Can you remember all of them? Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus and Lucius, Commodus, and now we get to 2 with very short terms, Pertinax, Julianus, and finally Severus. Okay, now for some superlatives. Who was the best emperor of the century? I've been thinking over this, and it's not as easy an answer as it at first appears. My gut reaction, and probably the most common answer you'll see if you look it up, would be Trajan. His conquests saw Rome expanded to its greatest extent it would ever achieve. But we have to consider his circumstances and also the wisdom of these conquests. Adding Dacia to the empire might have been lucrative in the short term, but in the long term, it was probably more expensive to control this territory across the Danube. And his attempt to conquer Mesopotamia was probably hopeless in the long term. The land between the Euphrates and the Tigris had little natural defense against invasion from the Persian uplands next door. I think Rome would have had to base 4 or 5 legions here to have any hope of defending the new provinces. Hadrian's move to abandon Mesopotamia was the right one. His abandonment of Armenia, that I'm less enthusiastic about. So Trajan doesn't really get a lot of credit from me for these conquests, except that he did them without significant losses. That gets him at least a few points. The other thing that holds Trajan back, I think for me, is he didn't have to overcome any major challenges. Now, that's no fault of his, but he operated entirely on a level playing field. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, okay, who overcame major challenges? And maybe you've landed at the same place I have. Commodus. No, I'm only joking. I'm thinking of his father, Marcus Aurelius. As I mentioned in the 170s, I didn't expect to like Marcus. But over his long reign, he won me over. He faced huge challenges, an aggressive Parthia, the Antonine Plague, and of course the problem he spent over a decade trying to solve, the Marcomannic Wars. I don't think any of the other emperors could have dealt with the challenges he faced as effectively as he did. I think if we took an averagely competent emperor and put him in Marcus's situation, the invasions and raids of the German coalition would have been far more severe, with perhaps the loss of Pannonia Superior and Noricum to the barbarians, and destructive raids right down into the heart of Italy. Let's imagine Antoninus Pius, who I do think was a good emperor. Imagine him, emperor 20 years later, facing the same problems Marcus faced. Instead of personally and relentlessly campaigning against the Germans and Sarmatians, I think Pius would have delegated the fighting to his generals. And then, soon enough, we would get Avidius Cassius, or someone like him, being declared emperor by his disgruntled soldiers. Then, in that civil war, the Germans would have been able to enter the empire unopposed. Not great. So even a decent emperor, who didn't strive as hard as Marcus Aurelius, would have seen disaster strike the empire. Now, that's not to say that Marcus was flawless by any means. I have 2 major criticisms of him. We talked already in the episode on the 180s about the failure of Marcus Aurelius to leave the empire to someone capable of ruling. But he just couldn't look past his own son. Doing so probably would have meant killing Commodus. Leaving him alive, but not as emperor, would have allowed him to become a rallying point for whatever faction was dissatisfied with Pompeianus or whoever else Marcus decided to pass the emperorship to. Neither of those options, killing his own son or enabling civil war, was a good option. So Marcus had little choice but to make Commodus his successor. Maybe something could have been done for Commodus' development, though. I mentioned that he was a rare case of the throne being passed from father to son. The only other time that happened since Augustus was when Vespasian passed authority to Titus and then it fell to Domitian. But Titus and Domitian had not been raised in the palace. They were already young men when the Senate declared Vespasian emperor. Commodus was the first emperor's son to be raised in the palace. Actually, Nero, although not directly Claudius's natural son, is probably the closest we've seen to an upbringing like Commodus's. Nero spent key years of his youth as the son of the Augusta, the wife of the emperor. And the similarities in temper and interests between Nero and Commodus are noteworthy. So maybe Marcus could have done something to keep Commodus from the corruption of luxury and authority until he had gained a more level head. Perhaps sending him to a tutor in the provinces or taking a younger Commodus on campaign with him could have worked. But this is all speculation. Maybe Commodus would have turned out poorly no matter how he was raised. Since it's not clear what Marcus could have done differently for his son, and remember he did try to raise Commodus well, I'm only deducting a few points from Marcus here. The other deduction Marcus gets is from overdoing the campaigns against the Marcomanni and their coalition. But didn't I just give him credit for the intensity and endurance of his response to the German incursions? Well, yes, but I think it went a little too far. Everything prior to Cassius's revolt seems logical to me, but when he returned to the frontier for the last time, our sources suggest he planned to make Marcomannia and maybe Sarmatia into 2 new provinces. Perhaps he felt like this was the only way to bring a definitive peace to the border, by adding new territory. The problem is that these new territories would have been completely undefendable. No significant natural borders would have stopped incursions from beyond. Already the Goths are pushing south and west, causing that cascade of peoples which put pressure on the Marcomanni in the first place. If those 2 provinces had been annexed, the Romans would have had a heck of a time defending them. Planning to add 2 provinces to these newly conquered lands is so unwise that some historians have doubted whether this was really Marcus's intention. But we can't know for sure, so we'll go easy on the philosopher emperor. Anyway, I think I'll say it clearly here. Marcus Aurelius, you win best emperor of the 2nd century. Trajan comes in second, more for his good governance than his conquests, and third place goes to Antoninus Pius. That was the superlative for best emperor, but it definitely doesn't coincide with the best time to live, unless you enjoy living through deadly plagues. As far as peace and prosperity go, the reign of Antoninus Pius stands out. But, if you choose to live then, you're probably also going to be alive for the shocks of Marcus's reign. Better to live as early as possible in the 2nd century. Ideally, you could be born in the year 100, grow up during Trajan's reign, and hopefully survive the revolts of the Kitos War, and live to the extremely, extremely old age of 65, dying just in time to avoid, dying from the plague. Alright, so the worst emperor. Is there any doubt that it has to be Commodus? I'll make a small case for someone else in a moment, but it's got to be Commodus. I'm afraid I undersold just how terrible he was, so let's reiterate his failings. He delegated the administration of the empire to a series of advisors who were terribly corrupt and cutthroat. All this corruption and selling off of offices led to disruptions in the stability and prosperity of the empire. It also upset the army. Some of these advisors were corrupt but effective, Pernus. Others were corrupt but incompetent, Cleander. The emperor was cruising along on a good track when Commodus became emperor. Under his first 2 advisors, the tracks became a bit bumpy, but the train kept cruising along. Under his final advisor, and in the final years when Commodus reluctantly made decisions for himself, the train came completely off the tracks. The government stopped functioning. On top of all of that, and these are the parts I undersold, I think, were his purges and confiscations. The killing started after his sister's plot to assassinate him failed in 182. He purged her and her associates, and somehow his advisor Sauterus got caught up in the mix and was killed too. Many of the senatorial class were killed for suspicion of aiding the plot. During Perinus' time as chief advisor, anyone seeming to threaten Perinus' place at the top was eliminated. He could lean into Commodus' paranoia and have almost anyone executed. And under Cleander, more were killed. With these 3 advisors gone by 190, Commodus was back to directly orchestrating the purges. We aren't given the exact numbers that died under his reign, but they were enough that the Senate was cowed. The killings had become so routine that by New Year's Eve of 193, the 3 conspirators feared for their lives if the emperor lived a single day longer. Again, we don't know how many senators he killed, but it seems the purges had gone beyond anything seen in the city since the days of Marius and Sulla, more than 250 years before. That's all bad, but our focus isn't just how Commodus mistreated the Senate. If he had governed well otherwise, maybe we could look past his murderous paranoia. Hey, that's exactly what I did for Domitian. But no, Commodus wasn't just a killer. He was a mismanager of the empire. I talked about Commodus' love for the arena, but perhaps I also undersold how frequent and how lavish these spectacles became. They cost an exorbitant amount of money to fund. The state was already short of cash. What with the funding a decade-long war in Germania and a reduced tax base thanks to the Antonine Plague. Funding these games didn't help to balance the books. Where do you go when you have no money? Confiscations and special taxes. Commodus confiscated property from anyone who looked a little suspicious or a little too rich. This didn't do a lot to maintain the finances, but it probably kept the games going for a bit. And then there was the debasing of the currency. This short-term fix kept the coins going where they needed to, but raised the cost of everything. It was bad for everyone. Okay, hopefully that's enough to establish that Commodus was the worst. A corrupt, murderous, depraved mismanager of the empire. On the other hand, I think you can make an argument that Pertinax was also very bad. Really? Pertinax? Well, I think if Pertinax had succeeded Hadrian or Antoninus Pius, he might have done an adequate job. He had the right ideas, but lacked the patience and flexibility to see them through. If he had slow-rolled his policies and maybe worked out a payment plan to the Praetorians for the rest of the donative that they were expecting, Pertinax could have avoided sparking the coming civil war. And without that civil war, I don't think we see the levels of military dictatorship brought by the Severan dynasty for a good deal longer. But we'll talk about that trend in the next episode and counterfactuals another time. Perhaps I'm wrong about this, but although Commodus was a terrible ruler and he ran the government into the ground, when Pertinax entered the imperial palace, it wasn't too late to turn things around. A more patient or cunning or militarily respected emperor might have succeeded where Pertinax tripped over his own feet. Alright, a few final comments on an emperor who I've hardly mentioned, Hadrian. Hadrian was an emperor of extremes when it comes to decision-making. In rapid-fire fashion, here are my assessments of his legacy. Abandoning Trajan's conquests of Mesopotamia? Astute. It would have been a real pain to defend. Abandoning Trajan's conquest of Armenia? Throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Armenia is much more defensible than Mesopotamia and provides a strategic position for any future clash with Parthia. A plan of consolidation and assimilation? Wise. As the Roman Empire became less and less Roman, the empire needed a unifying ethos or culture to pull things together. 200 years later, Constantine will agree with this policy, but find his own solution. Forcing that assimilation on the already disgruntled Jews? Foolish and cruel. He is squarely to blame for the Third Jewish Revolt. He didn't have to build a pagan temple on the site of the old Jewish temple or rename Jerusalem after himself. It seems intentionally provocative. Causing this war loses Hadrian a lot of points. Building his wall across Britannia? Impressive, but a waste. The wall required a significant garrison to defend, and even then, some raids still got past. It would have been a better long-term solution to follow Agricola's lead and just conquer the rest of the island. There were 3 legions in Britannia. I think if the whole island had been conquered, including all of Caledonia, the Romans could have gotten by with just 2 legions there. And hey, maybe after 2 generations had gone by and the Caledonians had assimilated into nice Roman subjects, maybe a single legion might have been able to protect the island. No wall needed. Traveling to almost every province? Impressive, but a waste. It was good for the emperor to see the reality of the provinces instead of being solely surrounded by the opulence of Rome, but it wasn't necessary or efficient. Trajan had gotten by just fine without visiting Africa or Britain or Bithynia. He, and certainly other good emperors like him, kept up a constant correspondence with the local governors and other officials who were able to get a better picture of the needs of their provinces than Hadrian was able to do on his week or month-long visits. And instead of personally being responsible for every new temple or every new bath, a good emperor in Rome could leave it up to the locals to decide what to do, where to build, who to dedicate it to. But Hadrian had to get personally involved and get the credit for himself. His tours couldn't have been cheap either, what with supplying, transporting, and entertaining the imperial entourage for years at a time. So, for these reasons, but especially provoking the Third Jewish Revolt, Hadrian does not make our top 3 list of emperors. Alright, that's enough for this one. Next time, we'll get into a few trends going on across the century, and we'll check in on the neighbors of Rome. And following that, we'll answer some questions and explore some what-if scenarios. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and rate the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can also subscribe to the series on Patreon or make a one-time donation there. Again, I've begun to publish serialized installments of decades on Substack. For example, instead of covering all of 70 to 79 AD in one installment, each post covers one section. The destruction of Jerusalem as one thing, the revolt of the Batavi as another thing, an eyewitness to Vesuvius's burying of Pompeii as another thing. If you want to go back and read some history with maps and pictures to go along, please subscribe there at 202decades.substack.com. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.